So if you really think about the concrete foundation of Western theology, I mean, we operate under this assumption that it's just well fixed.
Right, completely solid.
Yeah, exactly. We treat it like engineering. You pour the concrete, it cures, you build the house of your entire worldview on top of it, and you point to the floor and declare, this is solid ground.
Mm.
But what we're looking at today is that when you subject those ancient texts to rigorous linguistic and historical analysis, that concrete starts looking remarkably like a shifting tectonic plate.
It really does. And that assumption of permanence is precisely what we are challenging today. I mean, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are looking at a theological landscape that, it requires stripping away centuries of interpretive layers.
And the stack of sources for our journey today is intense.
Oh, absolutely. Our analysis is anchored by J.L. Wu's highly provocative 2026 book, 151 Questions Christians Are Afraid to Ask.
Which is such a bold title.
It is, yeah. And we're looking at that alongside several really dense theological essays that dissect the friction between the original Hebrew texts and the later Greek philosophical frameworks of the New Testament.
Right. And the overarching mission here, the core argument across all these materials, is really a call to action for you, the listener. It's about why believers are morally and intellectually obligated to critically examine literally everything they are taught.
Yes. Everything they read, hear, watch, everything.
Which fundamentally disrupts the way modern religion is often practiced today. I mean, for a lot of people, diving into religious history and questioning these deep-seated traditions, it can feel like, I don't know, like touching a live wire,
Sure, it can be incredibly destabilizing. But we're going to act as guides here. We are examining these texts objectively, breaking down the historical and linguistic arguments presented, regardless of your personal background.
Because the premise of Wu's book and these essays is that humanity was engineered with the explicit capacity to think, to analyze and verify. So leaving your brain at the door when you walk into a church, that's not a sign of piety.
No, the sources argue it's actually an abdication of your very design. Ultimately, we are accountable for what we do, not just the doctrines we, passively believe.
Okay, so to understand the necessity of all this critical examination, we have to start with this sociological reality that Wu identifies. He calls it the culture of silence.
Right, which is detailed right in the preface of the book. It's this pervasive psychological phenomenon within religious institutions.
And he's not just talking about the folks in the pews.
Right, not at all. The author specifically includes pastors, seminary professors, and church leaders in this demographic. Basically, they harbor these profound, sometimes destabilizing questions about the biblical text or inherited doctrines, but they actively suppress them.
The sociology of that suppression is just fascinating to me because it stems from this deeply ingrained fear of social and spiritual exile.
Exactly. There's this implicit institutional rule that expressing uncertainty is the same thing as undermining your own faith.
Right, like if you admit you find a specific doctrine illogical, you risk being labeled a heretic or just a doubter by your entire community.
And the cognitive dissonance that creates is just staggering. People are walking around carrying the weight of massive theological contradictions.
But the fear of rocking the boat just forces them to push those questions down, which, creates this environment of total deference to authority. You end up relying entirely on the pastor or the priest or some theological commentary to basically mediate the truth for you.
And that deference is exactly where the book identifies a critical methodological trap. That's what the author calls the bait and switch of church history.
Okay, let's unpack that. What's the bait and what's the switch?
Well, the bait is the foundational message of the early Jesus movement, which, as the sources point out, was largely action-oriented. It was rooted in first-century Jewish orthopraxy, meaning right practice or right action.
Right, living a certain way.
Exactly. But the switch happens when that simple restorative message gets overshadowed by these highly complex, non-negotiable creeds.
Like the Nicene Creed.
Precisely. We see this culminating in the 4th century with Nicaea and the subsequent councils.
Yeah.
Suddenly, institutional belonging requires adherence to a massive, philosophically dense checklist of dogmas.
So, if you fail to mentally assent to the precise metaphysical definitions laid out in the Creed, you're just placed outside the boundaries of the faith.
Yes. And this transition forces believers into an a priori approach to the text.
A priori meaning, starting with the conclusion already in hand.
Right. You are handed the predefined conclusion, the creed, and then you're taught to read the biblical text solely to find evidence that supports that conclusion.
Which is basically confirmation bias on a systemic level.
It is. The a priori method is intellectually fatal when you're analyzing historical texts. Because if you begin with the premise that a 4th century Hellenistic creed is the absolute unquestionable truth, you will inevitably force the 1st century Hebrew and Aramaic evidence to fit that 4th century mold.
You just create a massive echo chamber.
Exactly. So the sources we are examining insist on a posteriori approach.
Okay, so working backward from the evidence.
Right. You must examine the historical data, the linguistic context, and the textual evidence objectively first. You assume nothing. And only then do you follow that evidence to its logical conclusion. The methodology required here is explicitly compared to forensic science.
Oh, I like that comparison.
Yeah, think about it. A fair criminal justice system doesn't decide a suspect is guilty and then retroactively search the crime scene for clues to frame them, right?
I mean, ideally, no. That would be completely corrupt.
Exactly. A proper forensic investigation analyzes the raw data of the crime scene to determine reality.
But the tension there is that modern religious frameworks often frame this kind of rigorous forensic analysis as a lack of faith.
Right, because the prevailing concept of faith in the West is essentially blind trust.
It's the parachute analogy. I hear this one all the time.
Go ahead, lay it out.
Okay, so the analogy is if you're preparing to jump out of an airplane, faith is trusting the person who packed your parachute. If you insist on opening the pack, inspecting every single silk thread, analyzing all the stitching, and then packing it yourself well, the argument goes that you aren't demonstrating faith at all. You're just demonstrating a need for control. Isn't the whole point of faith to just trust blindly?
Well, while that parachute analogy perfectly encapsulates the modern Western assumption of faith, the Hebrew texts actually present a diametrically opposed definition.
Wait, really? So it's not about blind trust?
Not at all. According to these sources, biblical faith, in its original Near Eastern context, was never synonymous with blind trust in the unverified. And this leads us directly into the question of human design.
Okay, I see where we're going.
Right.
Because if the creator didn't intend for humanity to just blindly jump out of an airplane, we have to look back at the actual genesis of human consciousness.
Exactly. The Genesis narrative establishes a highly specific blueprint for how humans were engineered to operate. And it's rooted in this concept of being made in the image and likeness of God.
Let's really unpack the linguistics of Genesis 1 here, because the Hebrew word used for God, Elohim, and this whole concept of his image have been severely distorted by anthropomorphic thinking.
Yes, people hear image and they immediately assume a physical shape, like a human body with arms and legs.
Right, but God is not a physical human being. The focus in the Hebrew text, according to Wu, is on the word kaya, which translates to alive or living.
And the essence of Elohim being alive is that he possesses intellect, he communicates, he evaluates, and he issues instructions.
And you really need the ancient Near Eastern context to get why this matters so much, right?
You do, because surrounding cultures in Egypt and Canaan, they worshipped idols that were literal, physical images of their deities. But those idols, they possessed mouths but were incapable of speech. They had eyes but possessed no vision.
They were just dead matter.
Exactly. So Genesis presents this radical polemic against that idea. When the Creator makes humanity in his image, he imparts the neshama, the breath of life.
And because humans possess this divine breath, we're endowed with the capacity for reason, for complex communication, and for the wisdom to actually exercise moral choice.
Right. Humanity is the living, breathing representation of God's active intellect on earth.
And that intellect is directly tied to the mandate of dominion, which is another word that gets totally misunderstood today.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, in modern English, dominion usually carries this connotation of exploitation, right? Like, bulldoze the forest so we can build a strip mall and a parking lot.
Yes, but the text frames dominion as stewardship. Specifically, it likens it to the management of a vineyard.
Which is an incredibly complex job.
It is an intensely analytical endeavor. To manage an ancient agricultural ecosystem, you must understand the soil chemistry, the weather patterns, the pruning cycles, the threats to the crop.
It requires constant active decision-making. You're constantly evaluating.
Exactly. And the implication for you, the listener, is just profound here. Because if your fundamental factory-setting design is to be an intelligent, analyzing, vineyard-managing entity,
then suppressing your critical faculties in the name of piety is literally a rejection of your divine design.
yes, abdicating your intellectual responsibility to a creed or a church leader is not an act of humility. It is a refusal to utilize the very hardware you were given.
It's like, okay, it's like someone giving you a state-of-the-art supercomputer equipped with this incredible hardware of intellect and the software of free will, and you're just using it as a paperweight.
Because you're terrified of pressing the wrong button.
Right. But the designer wants you to run the programs. He engineered the system specifically to run these complex analytical programs.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
But, okay, this brings us to a massive contradiction in Western theology that the sources point out. If we possess this incredible machinery of free will and intellect, why does so much of traditional theology, specifically like the Reformed tradition, claim that our hardware is completely broken?
You were pointing to the doctrine of total depravity.
Right, original sin.
Exactly. It's a cornerstone of the Calvinist framework. The premise is that following the transgression in the Garden of Eden, human nature was fundamentally altered.
Like a virus corrupted the hard drive.
Yes. The idea is that the human will became utterly enslaved to sin, rendering every individual completely incapable of choosing good or even responding to the Creator without a prior overriding intervention of divine grace.
So it posits this fatal virus in the human operating system that just passes genetically from generation to generation. But the sources we're analyzing today deliver a really fierce critique of this framework.
They do. They argue that the entire concept of total depravity is a later theological invention that is entirely absent from the Hebrew Bible.
Which is wild to think about considering how foundational it is for so many.
It is. The texts trace this doctrine back to the 5th century, specifically to Augustine of Hippo. And they argue it's based on his reliance on a flawed Latin translation of a single Greek verse in the New Testament, Romans 5.1.
Wait, a mistranslation like Augustine just got the grammar wrong?
Basically, yes. Augustine's formulation of original sin is a classic example of theology built on a linguistic error.
Break that down for us.
So the original Greek text of Romans states that death spread to all men because all sinned. The Greek phrase is ho.
Okay, because all sinned makes sense.
Right. However, Augustine didn't read Greek well. He was working from a Latin translation that rendered this phrase as in quo, which means in whom.
Oh, wow. So instead of because all sinned, it became in whom all sinned.
Exactly. He concluded that all of humanity sinned in Adam, participating in his specific guilt and inheriting his corrupted nature. And this one Latin mistranslation became the bedrock of Western anthropology.
But when we bypass Augustine and go back to the primary source code, the Hebrew Bible, the narrative following the Garden of Eden explicitly contradicts this idea of a broken human will.
It really does. And the most compelling evidence the sources highlight for this is Genesis 4.7.
Right. This is the story of Cain and Abel.
Yes. This is the Creator speaking directly to Cain. And remember, Cain is a post-fall, post-Eden human being. And God is speaking to him right before he murders Abel.
And the text says, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it.
And the Hebrew word used there is timsel, meaning you shall rule.
Which carries immense theological weight. Because if the doctrine of total depravity were accurate, God's instruction to Cain here would be completely nonsensical.
And inherently cruel. To demand that a creature devoid of free will somehow master its dark impulses is to demand the impossible.
It would be like yelling at a dog to do calculus.
Right. But the command, you should rule over it, unequivocally proves that human free will and moral agency remained fully intact after the expulsion from the garden. The hardware was not broken.
The sources also bring in Deuteronomy 24.16 to dismantle this idea of inherited genetic guilt.
Yes, which is a foundational law of biblical justice. The text says, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers. A person is judged for their own sin.
So you don't go to jail for a crime your great-grandfather committed.
Exactly. And the contrast here between Western Protestantism and the original Hebraic worldview, which is actually still somewhat preserved in Eastern Orthodoxy, is striking.
Right, because in the Hebrew framework, you might inherit the consequences of your ancestors' actions, like being born into an exiled state outside the garden, but you do not inherit their guilt.
Because holding an individual morally culpable for a crime they did not commit violates the fundamental parameters of divine justice established in the Torah. The mechanism of justice requires personal agency.
Okay, but let me push back on this assertion of robust human free will, just playing devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
If humanity isn't totally depraved, and we retain this uncorrupted capacity to choose good, then why is the world such a mess? I mean, the sheer volume of human atrocity demands an explanation. And furthermore, if God has total foreknowledge of all these catastrophic choices we're going to make, Why does he even allow the test in the first place?
That is the ultimate question. And addressing it requires a complete reevaluation of the nature of divine omniscience.
Okay, how so?
Well, we generally operate with this Hellenistic assumption of static determinism.
Meaning the future is a fixed, entirely pre-written script, and God is just passively observing it unfold.
Right. But the sources argue that the biblical concept of testing, which is captured in the Hebrew word nasa, reveals the dynamic interaction between divine providence and human free will.
So, dynamic omniscience, meaning God's knowledge responds in real time to genuine human choices.
Yes. The narrative of Abraham and Isaac is the prime example they use. It is only after Abraham actually raises the knife that the text records God saying, "Now I know that you fear God."
Wow. So if the outcome was rigidly predetermined, the test is just a charade. It's a fake test.
Exactly. The assertion here is that because human free will is actual and potent, the future remains open. It is actively shaped by human agency.
So God's power isn't about micromanaging every single decision to eliminate failure. It lies in his ability to perfectly respond to and integrate any human choice into his overarching purposes.
That's beautifully put. The conditions placed before humanity in the biblical text, the constant refrains of "if you obey and if you follow," they're not just rhetorical devices. They're genuine forks in the road. The test is authentic.
Okay, so since we've established the reality of our intellectual autonomy and our moral agency, the mandate from these texts is to apply this a posteriori method, this evidence-based method, directly to the traditions we've inherited.
We have to put it to the test.
Right, we have to subject these bedrock dogmas to the forensic investigation the sources advocate. And the most immediate, culturally pervasive example of this is the story of Christmas, the nativity of Jesus.
Oh, this is a fascinating area of the book.
Because every December, modern tradition conflates two entirely distinct gospel accounts into this single cohesive pageant, right? You have the wise men, the shepherds, the star, the manger.
But a critical, objective reading of Matthew and Luke reveals massive historical and textual irreconcilabilities.
Irreconcilabilities is a big word. Tell us what you mean.
Well, the discrepancies are frankly impossible to ignore if you apply a standard historical critical method. Let's look at Matthew's gospel first. Matthew firmly anchors the birth of Jesus during the reign of King Herod the Great.
Okay, and we have secular historical records for Herod.
Yes, and those records definitively place Herod's death in the year 4 BCE.
4 BCE, got it.
And Matthew's narrative includes Herod's decree to execute children 2 years old and under. So historically, that places the birth roughly around 6 BCE.
Okay, so around 6 BCE for Matthew. And where are Mary and Joseph living in this account?
In Matthew, they're portrayed as already residing in a house in Bethlehem. There is no long journey on a donkey.
Okay, but Luke's timeline completely shatters that framework, doesn't it?
It does. Luke introduces Mary and Joseph as residents of Nazareth up in the northern region of Galilee, and their travel to Bethlehem is compelled by a Roman census instituted by Quirinius, the governor of Syria.
But here is the historical catch.
Right. The geopolitical reality is that Judea did not become a direct Roman province subject to such taxation until the deposition of Herod Archelaus.
Who was Herod the Great's son?
Correct. And that deposition and subsequent census happened in 6 CE.
Wait, 6 CE? So Matthew 6 BCE and Luke is 6 CE. That's a 12-year gap.
Yes, that 12-year chasm cannot be historically reconciled. And there are other logistical issues, too. Roman administrative practices regarding taxation censuses registered individuals at their current place of residence and economic activity.
Right, because they want to know what you own so they can tax you where you own it.
Exactly. So the concept of forcing a massive population migration based on ancestral lineage from a millennium prior, returning to the city of David just because you're descended from him, that contradicts all known Roman logistical methods.
It just wouldn't make sense for the Roman IRS to make everyone travel across the country to where their great-great-great-great-grandfathers.
No, it would collapse the economy.
Yeah.
So the sources posit that Luke utilized the census as a narrative device, a way to maneuver his subjects from Nazareth to Bethlehem to fulfill prophetic expectations, whereas Matthew simply originated his narrative in Bethlehem.
And this forensic analysis doesn't just stop at the timeline. It extends to the date itself, right? December 25th.
Oh, certainly. The adoption of December 25th has absolutely no basis in the biblical texts.
None.
The sources trace the assimilation of this date to the Roman solar festivals, You had the festival of Saturnalia and the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun.
Which was officially instituted by Emperor Aurelian in 274 CE, right on December 25th.
Exactly. It dominated the cultural landscape of the Roman Empire. So what we see is a strategic 4th century cultural co-optation by the church. They basically replaced the birthday of the sun with the birthday of the sun.
They just swapped the holidays.
Pretty much. But while the historical mechanics of the nativity and the liturgical calendar are, significant, the sources argue that the most profound application of this critical method involves the doctrine of the Trinity.
Oh, this is the big one. This is the ultimate litmus test for orthodoxy in the West. The proposition that the Creator exists as three co-equal, co-eternal persons sharing a single divine substance.
But the texts we are analyzing today argue that this conceptual framework was entirely foreign to the Jewish worldview of the original authors.
And the evidence the sources pull from the gospel text to demonstrate this is really compelling. They specifically focus on the language Jesus himself uses regarding the nature of God.
Yes, let's look at Mark 12. A scribe questions Jesus about the greatest commandment, and Jesus responds by reciting the Shema.
Which is the absolute non-negotiable core of Jewish monotheism. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Right. And then the scribe affirms this, stating, He is one, and there is no other but He, deliberately employing third-person pronouns.
And Jesus doesn't correct him. Jesus validates the scribe's theology, explicitly affirming a paradigm where God is a distinct He, separate from Jesus himself.
And this distinction is maintained even in the highly symbolic language of the book of Revelation. Look at Revelation 3:12. You have the resurrected and glorified Jesus speaking from a position of ultimate authority in heaven.
But even then, he consistently subjects himself to the Father. He utilizes the phrase, my God, 4 distinct times in a single verse.
Yes. He references the temple of my God, the name of my God, and the city of my God.
So the analytical question here is just unavoidable. If the speaker possesses full ontological equality within a triune Godhead, the repeated designation of another entity as my God introduces severe logical incoherence.
It does. So the argument these sources build is that the Trinity was not a revelation of the first century, but a construct of Hellenistic philosophy that was formalized much later at the Council of Nicaea.
Because as the early Jesus movement expanded beyond its Jewish origins into the broader Greco-Roman world, the Gentile church fathers started taking over.
And they began interpreting Hebrew theological concepts through the lens of Neoplatonism and Greek metaphysics.
And the linguistic friction between Hebrew and Greek thought here just cannot be overstated. I mean, Greek philosophy is obsessed with ontological abstractions, right? Essences and the categorization of substance.
Exactly. But the Hebrew worldview is relentlessly concrete. It's relational, and it is defined by action, not abstract substance.
So when the Council of Nicaea employed the Greek term homoousios,
Meaning of the same substance?
right, to define the relationship between the Father and the Son, they imported a metaphysical category that the original Hebrew texts never even contemplated.
Never.
It's the ultimate recipe analogy.
Yeah, guys, hear this one.
So imagine you take an ancient, carefully preserved family recipe, right? And you translate it into a completely different language and cultural paradigm. But the local markets don't carry the foundational ingredients, so you substitute half of them. And then you apply entirely different cooking techniques. You boil instead of bake. And then at the end, you express outrage when someone points out that the resulting dish bears literally no resemblance to the original. You fundamentally altered the chemistry.
That is exactly what happened historically. And the alteration of that chemistry shifted the entire locus of what the Creator demands of humanity.
Because if the defining characteristics of your faith are based on Greek reinterpretations and the metaphysical consensus of 4th century councils, then religion just becomes an exercise in intellectual conformity.
Yes, checking boxes on a theological test. But the sources argue that from the perspective of the Creator, adherence to an abstract philosophical framework is largely irrelevant. The metric of judgment is almost exclusively focused on human action.
Which means we really need to dive into the profound linguistic difference between the modern Western concept of faith and the original Hebrew concept of emunah.
This distinction completely rewires how you read the text. Because in our contemporary lexicon, faith has been reduced to an epistemological leap in the dark.
Right. It's the conscious decision to maintain mental assent to a set of propositions or creeds or historical claims, even in the absence of empirical evidence, or sometimes even in defiance of it.
But the linguistic reality is that the ancient Hebrew language possesses no vocabulary for that specific concept of blind mental belief. The operative word in the text is emunah.
And emuna shares its etymological root with the word amen.
Yes, and amen is not just a passive concluding remark you mumble at the end of a liturgy. It is a declarative statement. It translates roughly to, I have heard the instruction, I affirm its validity based on historical precedent, and I commit to acting upon it.
So emuna is best understood as faithfulness, steadfastness, observable fidelity.
Exactly. The epistemological basis for immuna is evidence. When the Hebrew texts commend the Israelites for their faith, it is not because they managed to mentally conceive of some invisible deity.
Right, it's because they possessed the tangible historical evidence of the Exodus, and they chose to align their actions with the God who executed it.
And the sources argue forcefully that mere mental belief, if it is isolated from action, is utterly useless to the Creator.
Okay, so to illustrate how action dictates reality in the Hebrew mindset, the texts dissect the concepts of tav and ra, which are conventionally translated as good and evil.
Right. Now, Hellenistic thought conditions us to view good and evil as cosmic abstract forces locked in this dualistic Star Wars-style struggle.
The light side versus the dark side.
Exactly. But in the Hebrew paradigm, Tav and Ra are strictly relational and functional. They are determined entirely by the perspective of the one evaluating the action in relation to a specific standard.
And the narrative of the Garden of Eden provides the perfect mechanism to explain this. Think about when Eve evaluates the fruit of the tree. The text states she saw that it was tav.
Right. From her subjective perspective, her localized evaluation, the fruit was desirable. It offered sustenance and wisdom. Her eyes determined it was good.
However, from the perspective of the Creator, the act of consuming the fruit was raw. It was evil.
But the fruit itself contained no inherent magical malice.
Right. The action was raw solely because it constituted a direct violation of his explicit instruction, his Torah.
Exactly. Tav is defined as action that aligns with the Creator's design and commands. Raz is action that fractures that alignment. The entire framework revolves around action and perspective, not abstract states of being.
So the practical application of this is actually really severe, because it means an individual can sit in a sanctuary, possess perfect orthodoxy, mentally affirm every single tenet of the Nicene Creed, and successfully defend the metaphysical nature of the Trinity.
But if their material actions are unjust, if they exploit their labor force, engage in deceit, or ignore the vulnerable, they are failing the only test that matters.
Because the justice of God is an audit of deeds.
Yes, the sources emphasize that because we are engineered as responsible creatures possessing free will and intellect, divine judgment is consistently applied to our observable actions, never our internal theological formulations.
It's an audit. The financial audit metaphor is just inescapable here. I mean, think about it. The auditor representing the regulatory agency does not care how deeply you believed in the company's visionary mission statement while you were sitting in the boardroom.
No, the auditor only examines the receipts.
Exactly. If the ledger shows embezzlement, your passionate belief in the corporate ethos is completely irrelevant to your indictment.
That is a phenomenal way to put it. And to observe this action-oriented, receipt-based theology in its pure form, unpolluted by later Hellenistic abstraction, the sources point us to the teachings of Jesus in their original first-century Jewish context.
Specifically focusing on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7.
Right, because when we strip away the tendency to read these chapters as a list of impossible, ethereal spiritual ideals, they emerge as a hyper-practical manual for executing Tav, for living rightly in the eyes of the Creator.
And recontextualizing these passages changes their meaning entirely. Take Matthew 6.22, for example. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light.
Now, the Hellenistic reading interprets this as a mandate for mystical spiritual
I
perception.
mean, like keeping your soul pure from dark thoughts or something.
Exactly. But within Second Temple Judaism, the concepts of a good eye, ayin tova, and an evil eye, ayin hara, were standard idioms relating to commerce and wealth.
Right. A good eye denoted a generous person. An evil eye described someone who was stingy, greedy, and hoarding resources.
So Jesus is actually delivering a stark economic warning against the idolatry of wealth. He's not giving a lesson in mystical spiritual enlightenment.
It's about what you do with your money. And this material focus continues into his discourse on the birds of the air right after that.
Yes, Jesus asks his audience, "Are you not of more value than they?"
And the underlying logic there isn't merely a comforting platitude about divine affection.
No, humanity's superior value is derived directly from the Genesis mandate. We alone bear the neshama, the breath of life, and the capacity for moral agency.
And because we possess this immense responsibility, We are instructed to operate day by day. Just as the Israelites were forced to rely on the daily provision of manna in the wilderness, refusing to hoard it for tomorrow.
Humanity is called to faithfully execute their moral responsibilities today, free from the paralysis of economic anxiety about the future.
The ultimate synthesis of this action-oriented paradigm, though, is found in Matthew 7. Judge not, that you be not judged.
Oh, this verse has been so culturally weaponized.
It really has. It's used to demand absolute moral relativism, this idea that no one has the right to evaluate anyone else's behavior ever.
But in a Torah-observant, first-century Jewish context, abolishing the justice system would be completely heretical. The Torah explicitly demands righteous judgment and the maintenance of societal equity.
So the instruction is not a prohibition on judgment, it is a warning about the calibration of the scales.
Exactly. The text continues, "For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you."
Jesus is warning against hypocritical, unmerciful condemnation, because the exact standard you apply to your neighbor will be the standard the divine auditor uses to evaluate your receipts.
You set the parameters for your own final judgment based on how you treat others.
And the sources reinforce this emphasis on orthopraxy right action by pointing back to Deuteronomy 13 and the biblical test for identifying a false prophet.
And this criteria for validation is really shocking to a modern audience that's been conditioned to look for supernatural spectacle as proof of divine authority.
Right, because the Torah explicitly warns that a prophet may arise, offer a sign or a wonder, and the miracle may actually come to pass.
The supernatural event is not the metric of truth.
Which is wild. So even if a guy calls fire down from heaven, that doesn't mean he's a true prophet.
No, the definitive test is the content of their instruction. Do they lead the people to follow the commandments of the Creator, to act with justice, and to execute Tov?
If an individual commands fire from the sky but simultaneously instructs the community to abandon the Torah and engage in injustice, they are a false prophet. Action supersedes the miraculous.
Every single time.
Wow. Okay, so the entire theological structure circles back to the primacy of action and the responsibility of the individual. Let's pull all the threads of this analysis together for our listener.
Okay, let's do it.
The narrative we have traced through these sources begins with dismantling the fear of intellectual inquiry. We explored the divine design of the human mind, the chaya and the neshama, proving that our capacity to analyze and verify is not a flaw. It is our fundamental purpose.
And we deconstructed the myth of total human depravity, establishing that our free will remains fully intact and therefore our moral culpability is absolute.
Right. We observed how the a posteriori method, the forensic, evidence-based analysis, reveals the massive historical discrepancies in inherited traditions. From the 12-year gap in the dating of the Nativity to the Hellenistic philosophical contamination of the nature of God at Nicaea.
And the inevitable conclusion of stripping away those Greek metaphysical layers is the realization that abstract mental belief is a profoundly inadequate substitute for imuna, for steadfast, observable action.
Because you are a human being constructed in the image of the Creator. Your life, your intellect, and your moral agency are entirely in your hands. You are the steward of the vineyard, and your hardware is fully operational.
It is.
So the final synthesis for you, the listener, based on this rigorous examination of the text, is a mandate for autonomy. Do not let anyone, do not allow institutional pressure to guilt trip you into accepting dogmas or performing rituals that violate your logic and your conscience.
Reject the culture of silence. Refuse to accept the a priori conclusions handed to you simply because they carry the weight of tradition or institutional authority.
Exercise the intellect you were designed with. Evaluate the historical context, understand the linguistic nuance, and examine the evidence critically before determining your trajectory.
Because at the end of the audit, the metaphysical doctrines you passively affirmed in your mind matter very little. You are a responsible creature, and judgment is singularly focused on the material reality of what you choose to do.
It is a profound call to intellectual bravery and moral ownership. It's your God-given life, and it is in your hands.
And I think to leave the listener with one final thought, we must reconsider the very nature of our skepticism.
Okay, lay it on us.
If the Creator intentionally engineered our minds to constantly analyze, evaluate, and demand evidence, if critical thinking is the literal breath of God animating our consciousness, then we must entertain a radical possibility.
Which is?
The moments of our deepest theological doubt, when we are fiercely deconstructing the dogmas we have been conditioned to accept, might not be a failure of faith at all. They might be the exact moments our internal software is functioning precisely as the designer intended.
Oh man, your questions are not a glitch in the system. They are the system running at maximum capacity.
Precise.
Keep executing the program, everyone. Keep demanding the evidence, and whatever you do, refuse to leave your brain at the door. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.